Your career path, in this case, is found a kingdom, leave it to your nephew, get a city named Eumenea after him. Rome has a problem, and her name is Cybele. Rome shows up to this party with a complicated face. The Roman state did not, officially, run on eunuchs. There were no Roman Shah Reshi, no Rab eunuchs sitting next to the consul. Roman freeborn male citizens were forbidden by law from castrating themselves, and the very idea of a Roman magistrate without a beard would have caused a riot in the forum. But Rome did import eunuchs, and Rome did have a problem in the form of a goddess. In 204 BC, during the Second Punic War, a Roman delegation went to a sanctuary in Phrygia and brought back a black meteorite that was the official body of the goddess Cybele, also called the Magna Mater, the Great Mother. The Romans, desperate for any divine help against Hannibal, installed her on the Palatine Hill. The problem is that Cybele's priests, the Galli, had a particular theological tradition. They castrated themselves with a sharp piece of pottery in public. During an annual festival on the 24th of March called the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, the Galli wore yellow robes, jewelry, and women's hairstyles. They danced, they flogged themselves until they bled. They begged in the streets carrying images of Cybele on their backs, and the Roman Senate, having officially adopted this goddess as the savior of the Republic, had to find a way to permit her cult while forbidding her actual rituals to its own citizens. Their solution: only foreigners could be Galli. Roman citizens were not allowed to castrate themselves for the goddess until the Emperor Claudius finally relaxed the rules in the 1st century AD, presumably because by then Rome had bigger problems. Your life as a Galli in Rome is loud. You live in a temple complex on the Palatine, you dance during the Day of Blood, and most Romans would rather not look at you. The poet Catullus wrote a horrified 100-line poem about a young man named Attis castrating himself in religious frenzy and then immediately regretting it. The satirist Juvenal sneered about you, and yet the cult survives, the goddess stays on her hill, and you are never run out of town, because you are technically saving the city from supernatural disaster every spring. The empire that swore it would never tolerate eunuchs in government had, by the late Roman period, eunuchs running the imperial bedchamber, the wardrobe, and the personal guard. Theodosius's grand chamberlain Eutropius even became consul of the Eastern Empire in 399 AD, the only eunuch ever to hold that office, before being executed for the crime of having held it. China sends you to the Silkworm House. China is where the eunuch reaches industrial scale. The institution starts as far back as the Shang dynasty in the 2nd millennium BC, gets formalized under the first Qin emperor in 221 BC, and runs continuously, with one short Sui-era pause, until 1912, when the last Chinese imperial eunuch retired and the dynasty itself ceased to exist. That is roughly 3,400 years of consecutive operation. No other Chinese institution comes close. Your Han Dynasty entry to the profession had 2 flavors. Flavor 1, castration as legal punishment. The state had a sentence called the Gong Xing, sometimes translated, with grim Chinese poetry, as being sent to the Silkworm House because new eunuchs convalesced in heated, draft-free rooms, the way silkworm cocoons did. The historian Sima Qian, the man who wrote the records of the Grand Historian and gave us most of what we know about early Chinese history, was castrated in 99 BC for the crime of defending a disgraced general in front of Emperor Wu. He could have killed himself, which was the proper aristocratic reaction. Instead, he chose castration so he could finish his book. He finished his book. Flavor 2, and this is the more common one for ambitious families, was voluntary recruitment. Poor families would offer up a son. The operation would happen. If the boy survived, he had a job for life inside the palace. The procedure, recorded in detail for the later Ming and Qing periods, was performed in a hut just outside the palace gates by a hereditary specialist family called the Bai family. The fee was 6 silver taels. The local anesthetic was hot chili sauce. The patient was bound at the legs and waist. The cut removed the entire genital apparatus in one stroke. A plug was inserted into the urethra and left there for 3 days. If the urine flowed when the plug was pulled, you were a eunuch. If it did not, you were a corpse. Survival estimates from the Qing era hover around 2/3. You also kept the removed parts. The pieces went into a sealed box called the bao, the treasure, which traveled with you for the rest of your life, and got buried with you so you would arrive in the afterlife technically intact. This was not a metaphor. The treasure could be confiscated by your superiors if you misbehaved, and recovering it became a career-defining priority. You could be the second most powerful man in the empire, and still spend your free evenings worrying about the location of a small wooden box. If you survived, the rewards could be enormous. Kai Lun, eunuch of the Han imperial workshops, perfected the formula for paper around 105 AD. The book, and the printed word as we know them, descend from a man who was castrated in 75 AD. The Tang court at its peak housed thousands of eunuchs, and they essentially controlled the imperial palace army, deposing several emperors in the late 9th century. And the most famous of all, Zheng He, was a Muslim boy from Yunnan who was captured during the Ming reconquest at the age of around 12, castrated, sent to the prince's household, and 3 decades later was sailing the largest fleet the world had ever seen, 300 ships and 28,000 men, all the way to East Africa and back. He brought a giraffe home. The Ming court genuinely believed it was a qilin, a Chinese unicorn, and treated it as a divine omen confirming the mandate of heaven. You can do a lot with a giraffe in good timing. India, the Mahabharata, and the Hijra. India had its own version, with deep, deep roots. The Hydra community of South Asia traces itself, at least in living tradition, all the way back to the Mahabharata. In one famous episode, the warrior Arjuna spends a year in exile under a curse that turns him into a third gender figure named Brihanala, who teaches dance to the women of King Virata's palace. In another, the warrior Aravan asks to be married before his ritual sacrifice the next day, and no woman will agree, so the god Krishna takes the form of a beautiful woman named Mohini and marries him for one night. Hijras in Tamil Nadu still call themselves Aravanis after this story. They reenact the marriage every year at the Kuvagam festival. The historical institution itself is older than any Mughal-era reorganization, though it certainly was reorganized by them. References to a third gender category, sometimes called Napumsaka, appear in the Kama Sutra around the 3rd century AD, in the Manusmriti, and in early Buddhist texts. The Arthashastra, the great political handbook of Kautilya, lists eunuchs as palace staff in the 4th century BC, before the Greeks even noticed. Your role as an Indian eunuch in this earlier period, before the Delhi Sultanate gets there, is partly a religious figure, partly a court servant, partly a wandering performer. You attend births and weddings and you bless or curse the household with songs. People give you money to leave, or to stay, depending on whether they liked your blessing. You are inside the system without being a man of the system. Whether you are a forcibly castrated palace slave, like the ones the later sultans used, or a voluntary religious devotee, your social location is complicated. The British, when they showed up, found this confusing and criminalized the entire community in 1871 under a law called the Criminal Tribes Act. India officially recognized Hijras as a third gender again in 2014. Some traditions take a long time to come back. Byzantium, where eunuchs run the whole government. Constantinople is the place where the eunuch reaches his apex of administrative respectability. The Byzantine court, working with 1,000 years of Roman bureaucracy and the entire Persian and Assyrian template, simply admits the eunuch into the senior civil service and does not look back. A Byzantine document from the early 10th century called the Cleidorologion of Philotheus lists 60 grades of court rank. About 50 of them are open to eunuchs. Eunuchs hold some of the most powerful titles in the empire: Praepositus, Parakoimomenos, Chamberlain, Eparch. This is also where the eunuch becomes a battlefield commander on a massive scale. The greatest example is Narses, an Armenian-born eunuch who started as a humble cubicularius in the bedroom service of Justinian I and ended as the conqueror of Italy. In 532, during the Nika riots, he walked through the crowd in the hippodrome with a bag of gold, bought off the leaders of one faction, and let the rebellion split itself in half. 20,000 rioters died and Justinian kept his throne, all because the most dangerous man in the city was a small bald administrator with a lot of cash. In 552, in his 70s, Narses led a Byzantine army across the Po Valley, smashed the Ostrogothic king Totila at Tagane, and 18 months later wrapped up the longest war of the 6th century by killing Totila's successor Teius at Mons Lactarius. He governed Italy for the next 13 years. Justinian died. The new emperor Justin II asked him to retire. He did, sulkily, and history records that the Lombards invaded Italy because Narses, in his fury, allegedly invited them. Whether or not the rumor is true, the empire he had reconquered started crumbling within a year of his retirement. He was, by every account, 95 years old. Byzantine theologians actually argued, in serious treatises, that eunuchs were closer to angels than other men, since angels also did not marry or reproduce. The historian Theophylact compared them to the cherubim. There is a startling thing here. For 500 years, the empire that thought of itself as the heir of Rome and Christ ran on a class of unbearded administrators who would have caused riots in old Rome itself. Your life as a Byzantine eunuch can include high public office, ownership of vast estates, friendships with the empress, and occasional accusations of sorcery, because somebody will always whisper that the man who runs the treasury must have made a deal. A quick audit of the brutal math. Across all these civilizations, take a step back and look at the numbers, because they are brutal and consistent. Castration killed somewhere between a quarter and a third of subjects in the better documented Chinese cases, and probably more in less developed surgical traditions. Most empires used child slaves, war captives, or boys sold by destitute families, because adult castration was even more lethal. The ones who survived were placed in positions of trust no biological son could ever hold, and the empires that did this collectively dominated world history for almost 3,000 years. Why does the same institution keep showing up? 3 reasons, all unromantic. First, no inheritance, no dynasty risk. A eunuch cannot found a rival house, which is exactly why Philetaerus' nephew got Pergamon. Second, social isolation. Cut off from family ties, loyalty had to flow upward to the king. Third, harem security. The men in charge of the king's wives and concubines had to be men who could not father a competing heir, because the political consequences of one slip would be unsurvivable. The price was paid by children. The vast majority of these eunuchs were not adults volunteering for a strange career. They were boys, often poor, often slaves, often victims of war, who had a procedure performed on them that we would file as a war crime today. The system worked precisely because of how many people it broke first. So, how did it all end? Slowly, embarrassingly, the Byzantine eunuch class faded as the Komnenian aristocracy reasserted hereditary masculinity as the prestige template in the 11th century. The Persian and Arab successor states kept the institution alive in muted forms through the medieval period. The Ottoman court ran a parallel system into the early 20th century, with chief black eunuchs of the harem who held titles for life. Chinese imperial eunuchs only stopped showing up in 1924. When the warlord Feng Yuxiang formally evicted Pu Yi, the last emperor, from the Forbidden City. Sun Yaoting, the last Qing eunuch, died in 1996. He was 94. He had outlived the Qing dynasty by 84 years. His memoir was published 2 years before his death, and it is, frankly, devastating. So your life as a eunuch in every ancient civilization is, in the end, the longest job in human history. 3,000 years, 11 empires, and a constant rotation through palace, treasury, harem, monastery, fleet, and battlefield. You were trusted because you could not become a threat. You were used because you could not say no. You were occasionally exalted, once or twice, into something close to divinity, because for thousands of years, the people in power genuinely believed that the man without sons was the only man you could trust to keep the city alive. The next time someone tells you that history is the story of great kings, remember that the man writing down the king's words was very often the only person in the room who would still have a job after the king died. He had outlived the last 3. He would outlive this one. He was the bowbox. He was the silkworm. He was the one of the head, and nobody, in 3 millennia of empire, ever managed to do without him.